Good afternoon, everybody. It must be Thursday because this is our native strong town hall, and that happens every other week on Thursdays. So welcome back. Thanks for joining us again today. As always, our good friend Mark Denning is here with us. Also, our featured speaker, Dr. Lyle Ignace of the Gerald Ignace Indian Health Center. We'll be going over what's happening this week with COVID, updating you on numbers, vaccines, just anything that's new in the news. Hopefully we'll get to it all. And as always, we appreciate questions as we go through the day here. So just drop them in there's a chat box at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. Otherwise, if you are checking us out via Facebook, you can just throw a comment in there and I'll be sifting through those. And like I said, hopefully we can get to as many as we can. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to our friend Mark here. And again, like I said, thank you for joining us. And Dr. Ignace, thank you for being here as well.
Winabuju and way Maganaduk, not away Benazi, indigenous cause, Nemain Dodem, Anishinaabe Indao, Neopit Indon Jaba. Mark Denning here, and welcome everybody. We have a lot of questions going on out there. There isn't confusion, I think, as much as so much information coming out at this particular moment. A lot of families are wondering what is exactly that we should be doing. In one state, there's masks. In another state, the presence is still so very important. Schools are looking like these different policies. But the most important question to you as a mom or a dad, family member, or living in that multi-generational house, you still have an older person with you, vaccinated, and we understand there's breakthrough infections. There's a lot of questions yet. And we're not through this, we're not done. I think if we were, we wouldn't be getting together like this. So I'm looking forward to the information we're gonna get today, the update information, and just a word about our month, Native Relatives. Very important month, very exciting month, meaning this coming Monday, missing and murdered Indigenous women is going to be having an awareness day come Monday. So all of you out there, warriors, all, and like to talk to your kids, guys, if it's the time is now to be talking about, oh, I want to be better to my family, want to be better to the person in my life. Monday's a really good day to be gearing up for. That's why I got a candle here on my side right here. The folks out of Minneapolis, Duluth, and other Indigenous areas around the Great Lakes especially are saying, please, even if it's just to put a candle up at some point and make it a topic in your day, how awesome could that be? And also we got a State of the Tribes coming up. I know that the president actually, that's going to be delivering that, had a conversation with Dr. Ignace about our community and how awesome is that. Looking forward to later this month when we get the State of the Tribe. So lots of things to be aware of, but also we want to keep our families safe. So I'm going to take this moment right now and keeping our families safe, and let's talk with Dr. Ignace right now and see what we can find out about where we are in this pandemic. Dr. Ignace.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Jeremiah. And, it's good to be back. As Mark was saying, there's a lot of stuff coming out. And one of the things that I want to talk about is not just what's going on here in the United States, but I think what's going on throughout the world and what we're seeing, because what's happening overseas is going to impact what's going to happen to us here. And we're already starting to see that. And so it's important that we don't look at things in a bubble, and that we do take a very broad perspective on what's going on. So this is really a reminder of what Omicron symptoms are, and they can be as mild as just having some nasal congestion, runny nose, maybe having some sinus pressure, maybe a headache that's associated with that. feeling tired, having sneezing spells, episodes, having a sore throat, and a postnasal drip cough, and that leads to hoarseness. So those are the more common symptoms now that you're going to see, as opposed to the earlier days of COVID, of fevers, chills, flu. You may still feel like that, but previous COVID was much more symptomatic in that way. And we also know that there's a lot of asymptomatic cases that are going on as well. So I wanted to bring this slide together because from a microscopic molecule level, you get a better sense, and plus the kind of the stick diagram here of what the virus actually looks like. And I just want to remind folks that when we get our vaccines, we have our vaccine specific to one particular item, and that is the spike protein. So if you look like on the right-hand side at the very top, you see the spike glycoprotein and the spike S. That's what our vaccines are designed to create antibodies against. And that's it, nothing else. And so there are other components, other membranes, other specific genetic coded proteins that are on the virus that we don't have vaccines to. And I want to bring this up because it's an important point, because when we talk about individuals who have never been exposed or had vaccines before, they will see this virus as a new entity entering into their bodies. And as a result, our bodies will develop an immune response to this. But it's not just to one specific item or one specific protein. It is to all of the components to the virus. And so there's 20 very specific proteins that are kind of like these markers that our bodies will develop an antibody response to. Now that is much different and what we would call natural immunity, that type of antibody response to these 20 plus proteins, versus someone who's never, their bodies have never been exposed to the virus, but have been vaccinated, only have antibodies just to the spike protein. And so two different distinctions here on what vaccines can do and what natural immunity can do. And so as time goes by, we're going to see a lot more papers come out, a lot more discussion about what natural immunity is and how impactful and how strong responses can be, and actually how long natural immunity and its antibodies can stick in our bodies. So papers are coming out, and we're hearing more and more that a natural antibody response, our memory B cells and T cells in our body will store these long term, and it's much longer than what was previously thought of like it only lasts 3 months or only lasts 6 months. We're talking years now. We're not talking months of long-term immunity. We're talking long-term. So keep that in mind when you hear about discussions about COVID and antibody responses, what that actually means. So I want to take kind of a worldly view and look at it how it compares to the United States, because what we're seeing, what I'm seeing from abroad, it's a good comparison to what's going on here in the United States, but there are some things that we do well and some things that we don't do well. So when we start looking at vaccines, and this is data from Our World in Data. So you can put in countries that you want and look at comparisons over time with relation to COVID vaccines, ICU, and fatalities. So when you look at this, in the left upper hand corner, you see vaccine doses administered. So just as comparison, we look at Denmark, United States, Portugal, and Sweden. And so green line being Denmark, And then we see the other countries. Well, we're not doing as good as these other countries are when it comes to vaccination. Okay. And so this may also be one of the leading decisions why countries in the European Union, as everyone's hearing about in the news, are taking pretty dramatic steps in moving forward out of the pandemic. So when we look at new cases, right upper hand corner, we see that, gosh, look at what's going on in Denmark. Well, Denmark has a lot of cases, and number of cases per 1 million. We see that Denmark, Portugal, Sweden, then the United States. But what's interesting here is that all of these countries are on a downward trend. And that's important to keep in mind of what's going on. When it comes to ICU patients in the ICU per 1 million, we see that the United States is leading pretty much every other country in the world in the number of ICU cases. And then you have the other countries. And if you pay attention to what's going on in Denmark, the green line, you see they're on a downward trend of patients in the ICU. So even though they've had high case rates per 1 million and their downward trend is going down, their ICU admission rates have been going down, just like the United States has, everyone has. It's just, it's an interesting point to look at other countries and their ICU. Now, in terms of fatalities, right lower hand corner, we see the United States has the highest level, but it wasn't always that way. Other countries such as Sweden and Portugal have also taken high marks here. And in terms of the fatality rate here, based on case rate, you could make the case that the fatalities here in the United States, the rate is much lower than other countries. So, so it's important to look at not just what's going on in your own backyard, but what's going on in the world. And so Denmark has been in the news a lot in the past week. And it's interesting because, as I mentioned, their case rates are high, but they're on a downward trend. And their prime minister has basically come out and determined that the virus is no longer considered a critical threat to their society, and declared that no one will no longer be legally obligated to self-isolate if positive. BA2, kind of the sister cousin of Omicron, is now the dominant infection in Denmark. And the director of infection preparedness has basically come out, Tyra Krogh-Graus, has basically said there's nothing for it, nothing what we could do, but to let Omicron run through the population. And it's essentially what they are letting this do. It's impossible to stop the spread of an infection. Even with the severest of restrictions, it cannot be stopped. So it's not like Denmark is giving up and throwing away the towel here. I think they're taking a measured approach based on the trend of infection. And so their approach, given that there is such a high exposure to COVID, along with their high vaccination rates, they feel that they have reached kind of that pinnacle of herd immunity. And as a result, they feel that their cases will be dramatically down by mid-February. And so they're taking the steps now to basically open the entire country and to allow people to get back to normal lives. Now, this happened, what is today, the 10th, last week, and really was kind of the first countries in the EU to do this, and a lot of other countries are following suit. So I think when I started looking at why would they do this, it's kind of an interesting what Denmark did, and they may be looked at after this is all said and done as probably taking the best approach to the pandemic. Now, you know, they are following the information, the data that comes out from an epidemiological standpoint. But I think what is different with Denmark versus everyone else is that there is a really, they've taken a social consensus approach to how to address the pandemic, and have really limited the politicization of COVID. And as a result, they have a much better, a much broader buy-in and trust with the government and its approach. Now, yes, they've had pretty stringent restrictions, but at the same time, there's been a tremendous amount of buy-in from the general public as population as a whole, and accepting of the risks and really looking at personal responsibility. Now, their approach is always to allow a kind of a normalization of living during the pandemic, and I think that has allowed maybe that buy-in. But what's important is I think they've really looked at kind of a strategic approach on how to address this. And I think they took it from basically who are the individuals that are going to be the highest at risk. Now, what's interesting when you look at your data is that the average age of fatality in Denmark is actually 82 years of age, which is, by all standards, really our elders, our great grandparents. I mean, these are the oldest population in Denmark. Now, they focus generally on the seriously ill and tracking the inpatients in ICU, and knowing that the younger population, yes, there will be cases, yes, there will be illness, but the population groups that are going to be the most dramatically impacted were going to be the elderly. And so their approach was more of population-based strategy rather than a collective whole as kind of the approach that the United States took, kind of, one size fits all approach. They were more strategic in their prioritization of who should be protected the most. And they really focused on the older age group, and then less and less as you get younger. So this is kind of an important point, because now when you look at the result of infection and exposure and natural immunity, along with their high vaccination rates, you have a greater population that not only has been exposed, but also vaccinated to a point where, yeah, herd immunity is going to be there. We know there's going to be reinfections, yes, but that risk of hospitalization and fatalities dramatically go down. So Denmark has taken this approach, and they're kind of leading the effort here in the European Union of lifting. And they really looked at, say, hey, we're done. They've lifted a lot of their sanctions and restrictions. Now, other countries in Europe are following suit, such as France. They began lifting their restrictions, and that it's no longer necessary to wear a mask outdoors. Teleworking is no longer mandatory or advised, and capacity limits for concert halls, sporting match, and other events have also been removed. So you know, they're following suit to what Denmark has done. But Denmark doesn't, they're not mandating anything. There's no restrictions, no mandates other than perhaps some travel restrictions. But aside from that, they're really letting the doors wide open. Lithuania as well, they've dropped the need for self-isolation for travelers inside the EU and out, coming in and going out. They are no longer necessary showing certification when accessing indoor public spaces such as museums and cinemas, public spaces, no longer requiring people to show proof. Switzerland, as of January 22nd, those who are vaccinated or can prove they have been recovered from do not need to show a negative PCR rapid test before entering the country. So the work from home order and quarantine requirement ended on the 3rd. So a lot of countries now are following suit. Sweden, very much in the same boat. End of vaccine face mask mandates on public transportations. Norway, also the same way as well. They're relaxing a lot of their measures. So, so it's kind of important because we see not just here what's going on in the United States, but the European Union is ahead of everyone in the country. Greece, Portugal also have lifted their restrictions. Even the UK is starting to start looking at lifting their restrictions as well, what they call the midterm that's coming up. Midterm is a kind of English way of saying spring break, what happens here in the US. So they call it midterm being their spring break. So they're doing this in anticipation of what's coming in March. Now, if we look at what's occurring here in the United States, so where masks are mandated or recommended, you could see that not every state's the same. We have East Coast, West Coast states that have mandatory mask wearing, and then everyone else in the middle has some variation of no mandates to recommendation. So if you look at Wisconsin, we're a recommended state, we're not a mandate state. And so that's kind of where we are here in the United States. Now, what's kind of interesting in the last 48 hours, a lot of governors of states have come out by ending mask mandates. So, you know, states that had mandatory requirements are now lifting them and basically resembling pretty much every other state now with either no mandate or a recommendation. So California, Oregon, you know, Rhode Island, New Jersey, New York has come up. The more recent in the last couple, in the last day, Massachusetts, Illinois, Rhode Island. So a lot of these states that had mandatory masks are now are backing off on those as well. Now, what's kind of interesting here is that there is no uniform decision here as to messaging from a public health standpoint. And so while these states and governors are making these announcements of reversing their mandates, the current administration is still stressing and almost the opposite message. That's, you know, from the guidelines set from the CDC and White House, stating hospitalizations and fatalities are still high, and that people still need to maintain, you know, their mask mandates. So, kind of, we're going into a kind of a mixed message point here, and not just, you know, every state had its own message, but now it's really a dichotomy of a public health message from all the way from the White House all the way down to the CDC, to now it's more of a message of we're defaulting to the states to make their own decision based on their own numbers and so forth and so forth. And so there's no unified message anymore, and it's being defaulted to states, to the governors, to counties and their county public health making the decisions, and local school boards. And so you can see where where do you follow? Who are you actually going to kind of guide the effort here on transitioning out? It looks to me right now there's just a all-out rush for the door here to individually determine when their states are going to be lifting. Because the other issue that has also come up is states may say, well, yeah, we're not mandating masks anymore in public spaces, but we're still mandating in schools. Now, again, mixed messages, again, no uniformity, and it's not going to be consistent across the board. So there's going to be a lot of confusion. There's going to be a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration, because some things will not be required and some things will, and it won't make sense either way. No matter how you slice this won't look like what should be going on. Now, when we look at case rates throughout the country, the states that are circled with darker blue, these are the states that have the highest number of cases in the last 7 days. So California, Texas, North Carolina, and Florida. That's kind of that top tier of infections that are going on. And then you kind of had this mid-range of states. So as I mentioned, Illinois, Pennsylvania, Ohio, New Jersey. These are all states that are making these kind of declarations as to limiting mask mandates. And here in Wisconsin, the 7-day case rate has definitely gone down. Now, we're not a mandatory mask state, but it is recommended. So again, everything is starting to default to this recommended or no mandates at all, which, when you look at the profile of the entire country, there are states that were definitely not mandated and no masks, and now states are defaulting to kind of regression to the mean. For all you stats people, that's basically where we're headed. We look at what's going on in terms of admissions. Admissions of COVID cases. Not too long ago, we did have Delta. We had Delta as that kind of that spike right before October. And those are the admissions to the hospital. Now with Omicron, now this is just the profile of admissions. But yeah, the admission rate for hospitalizations did go up here in the United States as a result of Omicron. But you can see in the last 2.5 weeks that the case rate or the admission rate has dramatically gone down. And I put this red line here to the far, far right. And basically that's the number of admissions, and it has fallen below the peak of Delta if you go across. So we're at a point now where the trend has definitely gone down, and it looks like it will continue to go down, where we see the percent change, almost 25% reduction in admissions over the last two weeks. So this is pretty dramatic. And just like every other country in terms of the spread of Omicron was such a high, extensive rate up that the rate of hospitalization followed that. And as soon as Omicron started going down, admissions started going down. And that's really going to be the trend as we start moving forward here. So definitely a good indicator. And not every state's going to be the same. You know, looking at case rates here, you know, California, Texas, Florida, North Carolina, high admission, high cases relative to, let's say, Wisconsin or Massachusetts. And so, you know, decisions can be made here based on rate of infection as it relates to hospitalizations, as well as ICU and even fatalities. You know, states can start making these informed decisions on how to proceed forward by mask requirements or public requirements or vaccination status. I mean, a lot of things are changing, and that's important to see now. So are we following in footsteps of what's occurring in the European Union? I'd say yes. So what's occurring over there, we're about 2 weeks behind Europe. Europe had their spike of Omicron about 2 weeks prior to us. And so what's happening overseas, we'll start seeing here what's occurring here. Now, we do know that there are antivirals that we can take to minimize severity of illness. Paxlovid is definitely one, but it does come with its contraindications and side effects. So do know that this Paxlovid and the other medication, molnupiravir, are definitely in circulation. And then what's kind of interesting is the demand for these medications is not very high. I find that kind of interesting now, only because could this have been useful if these drugs were more readily available 2 months ago when they were approved, and the only problem is the manufacturing distribution of such high quantities could have been even more impactful in reducing the severity of illness or hospitalizations, even on the fatality, but they just didn't get out fast enough. And so as a result, we're now on the back end of Omicron, and the trends are going down across the board in almost every state. And the demand for these drugs are not there. Now, the supply of it is finally catching up, and pharmacies now have stockpiles of these medications after the fact. And so it's a bit disappointing in that these medications didn't get out there fast enough before Omicron, because you can anticipate, could this have lessened that hospitalization to hospitals or ICUs or even fatalities? And the answer is probably yes. It just didn't get out there fast enough. And so those are the two drugs. Now, Omicron, we know Omicron has blazed through every country. And, you know, countries like Mexico, India, the UK, they're pretty much saying, yeah, 100% Omicron. That's exactly what we're seeing. No other variant is currently out there. And I think yesterday, the CDC came out with an announcement that 100% of all COVID cases now are Omicron, and that they hadn't detected any Delta that is currently out there. Other countries, yeah, they still have, you know, Omicron as their primary, but Delta is kind of a distant second. And what's occurring in these high 100% countries will definitely follow suit in these other countries that are lagging behind. Now, this is data from the CDC website looking at the variants, and basically variants from October 31st to February 5th. Yellow being Delta, But as time has gone by, you see that starting to turn purple, 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 and then we start seeing this light purple. Well, like I mentioned, the CDC came out and said 100% is now Omicron and 0 Delta. So Delta is no longer of concern in circulation because it's just been outpaced by Omicron. Well, is it just all the original Omicron, or is this the BA2? Well, BA2 is also in circulation, but not at the rate or presence of the B1.529. So it's Omicron. Everything is Omicron from here on out until it burns itself out. And that's, I think that's interesting to hear that, yeah, Omicron has definitely outpaced Delta and every other variant in the world. And that's is clearly what we're into, not just here, but everywhere in the world. So pulling things back here to Milwaukee, went from that world view to the US to here in Milwaukee. Again, we're going on several months now, and the fatality rate per 100,000 is still 0 for natives. And that is really remarkable to see that there has been no fatalities. And we're going on at least 150 days. This is just the last 90 days. But if we look back as to when this started, we're talking about 150 days of no fatalities in the native population. At the same perspective, we're looking at mitigation prevention efforts, vaccinations, obviously a vital tool in prevention. Natives have the highest rate of vaccinations, even receiving 1 dose or being fully vaccinated, have the highest rate than any other ethnicity here in Milwaukee County. And I certainly believe that this vaccination certainly has a huge impact on the fatalities, the 0 fatalities of natives here in Milwaukee. In the state, 59.7% fully vaccinated. We see the native population as a whole, 44.5, as well as we see the other rates of other races and ethnicities. So what's in terms of vaccines throughout the country here, we see in the center part, the fully vaccinated by population. Here we have the population of 65 years of age and older. Almost 89% of the population has been vaccinated. That's a pretty good number. It's a pretty good number. Not as high as, let's say, Denmark, which is at 93%, but still nonetheless a very high rate. In terms of the total population, 64.2%. When we start looking at boosters, and we start looking at booster shots, and the total population, 42.5% have received boosters. And we look at 65 years of age and older, we see that that is only at 65.2%. So receiving that first primary series vaccination, critically important, and had reached a very high rate in our older population, which we all know is the most severely at risk for poor outcomes from having COVID. What's going on in the native populations here in Michigan, Minnesota, and Wisconsin? We see the number of confirmed cases, over 11,000 in Michigan, 17,000 in Minnesota, almost 16,000 here in Wisconsin. Now, when you start looking at these numbers, obviously they're high. We know they're going to be high. These have been rates, the number of cases over the last 2 weeks. So when you look at these numbers, you see, let's say Minnesota, almost 1,800 new cases in the past 2 weeks, 872 on the average. And when you compare that to the previous 2-week time block, it was almost 2,100. with almost over 1,000 cases on the average per week. When comparing that, the trend is going down, much like in Michigan, it's going down, as well as it is here in Wisconsin. So there is clear indication that Omicron is starting to recede in each one of these states. And you can see that the rate infection by population, native population, 19% in Michigan, 23% in Minnesota, and almost 31% of the native population. Now, take this with a grain of salt, because these are the number of cases that we know about, that the state does know about. We're not talking, this doesn't include the asymptomatic people, or the individuals who were sick but never tested, or people who did test but had a take-home test but never reported it. So this is at kind of that minimum rate of infection. Assume that this rate is actually much higher, and at least 15 points higher across each state for the native population. So this is only what we can confirm in terms of cases. Wisconsin as a whole, the trend is definitely going down, and it's going pretty fast in terms of how fast it showed up to how the rate of infections that were occurring to now. You know, we're hovering about 2,900 cases on the average. Now, if we start looking at how we compare this to what was going on in previous waves, well, we're pretty close to what's going on when Delta showed up. And then Alpha way back over a year ago before vaccines showed up. So these are all good indications and signs that Omicron has gone through the state, has gone through our communities, and is now no longer has anybody else to infect. So the numbers are going down. In terms of comparing race and ethnicity in the state, second in case rate, but I wanted to kind of show this slide because when you start looking at the cases by all age groups, second in case rate, but when you start looking at the bar graph, you see this high spike. That's Omicron. Everyone all at the same time is just going down the steep slope here at the same rate of decrease across all races and ethnicities. So everyone got infected. Everyone, each community is starting to see a trend that's going down really, really quick. Hospitalization rates, a little different picture. When you start looking at this, the number of admissions, this isn't a whole lot of admissions when it compared to other races and ethnicities, because when you look at all ages, this orange line, we're only talking about 25, 26 admissions compared to other races, let's say the African American teal line. That rate is actually, the number of admissions were actually much greater, almost 5 times greater than it was in terms of numbers. But again, that rate is pretty much equal now compared to all other groups. When we look at fatalities, now unfortunately, native population has the highest fatality rate, but when you look at pure numbers, how many are fatalities there are, we are only talking like 1 or 2 fatalities in the entire state. So the pure number is actually pretty low. But given our population is small compared to all of the races and ethnicities, when you start looking at deaths per 100,000, yeah, 1 person is a lot, and can change this curve dramatically. Now, I'm going to bring this back because we already kind of know this, but I don't think it necessarily has changed a whole lot from when COVID started to even right now. So this is information coming out of England as to the proportion of death certificate where COVID is listed And they start looking at other conditions, other pre-existing conditions. So what are those pre-existing conditions that puts people at a much higher risk of fatality? Diabetes, chronic lower respiratory disease such as COPD, high blood pressure, ischemic cardiovascular disease, underlying neurologic conditions such as dementia, Alzheimer's, cardiovascular disease such as heart failure, underlying cardiac arrhythmias, and then we have malignant cancers, lymphoma, and such. And then we have this line below here where COVID cases with no pre-existing condition. So in the UK, they're looking at maybe 16, 17% of their fatality had no prior conditions. When you start looking at other conditions in terms of rates, diabetes and COPD, high blood pressure, certainly outpaced all other underlying conditions. And so when you start looking at that number and you start looking at what pre-existing conditions are, well, we know that the Native population had high rates of diabetes. We know that we have a population that has high cardiovascular disease, such as high blood pressure, and we have a population that do smoke and that have underlying COPD conditions. So you can see where that risk, those pre-existing conditions, can certainly impact overall fatalities here in the States for natives. So no different here than it is in the UK. So very similar profiles, and it really hasn't changed. But again, it's highlighting the most significant health disparities that affect natives is true throughout the world. And here we have a trend, the time block of the last 2 weeks, data numbers looking at the number of cases by age group, hospitalizations, ICU, and fatalities. Looking at what occurred 2 weeks ago to what has occurred the last 2 weeks, we see the numbers have dramatically gone down by fourfold. But what hasn't changed is the population group, age group, and that's the 30-year-olds. 30-year-olds are still leading in the number of cases. What's kind of interesting is in terms of hospitalizations, back in January 26th, the highest age group, or the age group with the highest number of admissions to hospital and ICU were 70-year-olds. Now it has kind of started sliding back to now we're seeing the hospital admissions high in the 60-year-olds, both just in general or to the ICU. But that fatality rate is still quite high in the 80-year-old age group. So even though the numbers are receding and quite dramatically, we're seeing a slightly different profile, who's being admitted, who's getting admitted to the hospital. And it's starting to recede into this 60-year-old age group. So I took a look at this a little more closely, and if I could draw your attention to the left-hand side of this. So, and it's really kind of the raw data numbers where we see the percent, 1, 2, 3, 4th column, and you go down. In that lower section, you see 10% off the left, 20, 30, 50%. This is really looking at, these are all confirmed cases. And just like I had mentioned earlier, this doesn't account for all of the asymptomatic cases, all of the cases of individuals who fell ill but never got tested, or individuals who got sick, got tested with a take home but never reported it. And so if you take into account what percent of Wisconsin's population, would that be? If it was 10%, 20, 30, 50% more cases, you can kind of make an inference as to what the rate of infection overall for the state of Wisconsin would be. So that could range anywhere from, right now it's 24.5% of confirmed cases to as high as maybe 37%, maybe it's actually 40% of true cases out there that just weren't accounted for, which could very well be the case. So 40%, maybe 40% of the state actually has had COVID at one point in time over the last 2 years. So it's important to keep that in mind, because when we start looking at numbers and start looking at trends and case rates and admissions, you really need to take not just the numbers that we know, but also look at the estimated numbers that we don't know, because that actually will play into the rates, the fatality rates, as well as ICU rates and everything else that we track as metrics. And so, so what I'll do is I'll turn this over to you guys, Jeremiah and Mark. If there's any questions, I'd certainly be happy to answer those.
Hey, Dr. Ignace, I got one question the other day from I think they call it, and I don't know if the term's still used, a long COVID.
Yeah.
And this was their kind of view of it, and not looking for an answer right now, but perhaps when we get back together again. And it building off of what you just said, that it seems that our government, because how bureaucracies work, are one step behind of things. Like our masks, we I told you the last time we got together, someone was selling these on the Chicago street corner for $1 a piece, and because these were being handed out for free. So of course, people trying to make money, whatever it might be, but it was kind of behind everything. And that's what they were noticing, is sometimes it feels like the government's behind, the medication's behind, the peaks. Their question is quite simply, because of this, do you know, or does the Gerald L. Ignace Health Center participate in studies where they're looking for people with long-term COVID? Because they'd like to be a part of that, and maybe they could get ahead of things rather than always kind of being behind. So that's my first question.
Mm-hmm. That was kind of interesting. We are we don't officially partake in these kinds of studies, given the sensitivity and nature of being a research test subject. But now, it's not to say that long-term infections don't exist. I feel they do, but I think it's going to be much more subtle in their signs and symptoms. And probably one of the leading signs is going to be their taste and smell. Smell, probably the biggest one. And fatigue and foggy, just having a fogginess. These are going to be those, 1 and 2 kind of symptoms that will kind of define who are long-termers. We know that individuals who get COVID and recover, they fully recover and they're all the way back without any, sequela complications. And then we have a subpopulation that recover but have some lingering but not debilitating. And then we have a subgroup again who obviously are dealing with that long-term complications of lung injury and kidney injury and dealing with neurologic deficits because of prolonged hospitalizations or complications from COVID. And so it's going to take time to kind of peel away what's going to be effective in not only management, but also in treatment and recovery. COVID is new, and this is, we're still managing, there's still management of long-term, long haulers. And there hasn't been any real success story in relieving long haul symptoms. And so that's the unfortunate part, because there are trials, there are groupings, there are CDC is following people and evaluating and reassessing who is kind of that definition and who falls in treatments and empiric treatments, anecdotal treatments, and there hasn't been any real success. If there were, I think they would certainly announce it, but that information is pretty scant and pretty limited in identifying. Now, if there is someone who does feel they have kind of long-term COVID symptoms, I certainly would be willing to see these individuals and refer them to kind of that public health effort to help try to find an answer.
So a couple of questions are power related to different people, kind of not in the Milwaukee area, unfortunately, but I think it will affect some of our gatherings here. One is, as you look into the future, not that far, like, hey, where are we going to be in a year? More like we're talking March and April, where the beginning of powwow season kind of starts. They kind of, for the contesters, it's usually Thief River happening in Minnesota. For others, it's those smaller university powwows that are beginning. So one, and it's a two-parter, kind of what's your view of kind of when those contests gear up towards late March, April, and what's your advice to the university advisors out there that run those springtime UW powwows, like UW-Madison, like some of our other folks out there that are running those powwows come April. So that's one. So that's kind of two, and the last one, and I'm going to turn this over to Jeremiah after you're done answering this. I guess the third question in all of this is when powwows do come back. A committee member wants to know, do we still gather elders in an elder section seating? Because if an infection happens, won't it kind of spread to the most vulnerable, or are we better off kind of getting rid of our elder seating, preferred seating kind of stuff, let them kind of be with their families and moving around? I thought that was a good question, and you don't have to answer it right now either, but if we could come back to that, and because they're looking at an April date. So I think maybe I kind of understand the question, the quandary of that reserved seating for those folks in wheelchairs, the elders, the oxygen tank folks, that kind of stuff. So I'll leave that there. There's a lot, but Jeremiah, you can have the next one after these couple answers. Dr. Ignace?
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting question, because I think we're all, all institutions and entities that have kind of traditionally put on public events, having to, what does this look like, right now versus, a month and a half, 2 months from now. You could kind of squint and look at the bar graph and the trends that are going on, that you could say, yeah, you know what, in a month and a half, 2 months, these numbers may be pretty small, maybe really small. And what does that actually mean? Does that mean we're still masking? Does that mean we have to distance? Does that mean we have to be vaccinated, boosted? These are all, I think, really critical questions on putting on public social events such as powwows. Now, I think my advice to universities and tribes, if they're listening, I think any outdoor event would be the preferable venue to host any such event. I think we've all gotten a bit skittish about indoor events, and all have kind of suffered kind of this post-traumatic distress about COVID being indoors. Um, I think, when it comes to mask wearing, I think it comes to, an individual's comfort level. How comfort do they feel in such a crowded space, an indoor public space where ventilation's not going to be very good. I'm not saying don't host it, but I think it's at least important to be able to offer to individuals who want kind of that security blanket as to having that available for people who want kind of that extra level of certainty of protection. So I'm not opposed to universities or even tribes doing powwows. And I think as we get closer to those April, late March, early April dates, I think the numbers are going to be important. Now, let's say 3,000 on the average every day. Let's say in 2 weeks we're down to 1,000, in 4 weeks we're down to 500 a day, to maybe April we're down to 100 a day. Yeah, I would feel pretty comfortable in having a public event. I would feel pretty confident in assuring safety of that event in April, if those numbers are dramatically down, much more than they are right now.
So that actually is a good transition to the question I was going to bring up. The other day I saw, and it was kind of a cartoon, maybe making a little bit of a joke, but I think it had merit. And it was kind of poking fun at throughout this, now 2 years of a pandemic, when everything starts to look good, and then it seems like, okay, cool, let's pull back every sort of restriction or any sort of mandate or, whatever. The list goes on. And then, of course, not surprisingly, very shortly after that, numbers pick up again, and stuff hits the fan. And so again, we're in that same situation. Things are looking positive. You pointed out, obviously, states and different counties and municipalities, because it's not all on the same page, are pulling back restrictions, schools, whatnot. And I mean, right now restrictions are pretty much mask related, I think. Do you foresee that kind of the history repeating itself, or do you maybe see this? Is there something about this time that seems maybe different to you?
I think this time with Omicron, absolutely different. Yes, we see the dramatic numbers, and you guys can certainly attest to Omicron. In terms of severity of illness, and even no one likes to be sick. No one likes getting sick. And I guess looking at all of the original COVID when it came out, to all of its variants and high spiking case rates, the previous variants have shown to be quite dramatic in its virulence compared to Omicron. And so in comparison to Omicron, now, and now there being a much higher level of natural immunity as well as vaccination in all communities. Now, in terms of severity of illness versus in the very beginning, and we have therapeutics now, antivirals, oral, as well as monoclonal antibody therapy. We're in a much different position now than we were 18 months ago, before vaccines. And so now, when you look at Omicron, at least when I look at Omicron and I see what's going on, not just here, but also overseas, is that severity is less. Yes, people are being admitted, but their severity of illness is not as great as it was with Delta. And people are not requiring as much oxygen, and it tends to be more supportive. And there's quicker turnarounds of people being admitted and being discharged and on their way to recovery. Fatalities are trending down, as well as the ICU admissions here in the United States. So there's just a much different sense about the severity of illness related to Omicron, knowing that we have natural immunity as a good way of protection, as well as with vaccinations now than we did even with Delta and even with Alpha. Just a much higher level of confidence that this could very well be the end of this pandemic. And moving forward, looking at Omicron, could Omicron just burn itself out and become more seasonal, like the flu season is? All things are pointing in that kind of direction as to where we're going. When that will begin or when that's declared, I know states are declaring, hey, Denmark is saying, hey, take your mask off, we're done. I don't know if we're necessarily at that point, but I do feel that trend of that when is that pandemic going to be declared over to being now an endemic? I think we'll know it when we see it, and yeah, it could be in a couple months, it could be this summer, and so it's kind of wait and watch now as to when that's finally declared, because that's going to have a big impact on how we look at what resuming a normal way of living and socializing is going to look like.
All right, thank you. And just one quick question, and then I'll of course leave you with the last word. Just wondering if you have any, I guess more, or have heard any concrete updates on dates or specifics regarding vaccines for the 2 to 5 year olds. I know there's been some things thrown out here and there, but I haven't really seen anything concrete. But just if you've heard anything, and then I'll leave you with the last word. Thank you again.
Yeah, so vaccinations for less than 5. So we're looking and gearing up to be prepared to provide vaccinations to individuals less than 5 years of age with Pfizer. So we're on track. We still provide immunizations and first-time people who've never had vaccinations, as well as boosters. So we're preparing, and we're not going to slow down or stop until we reach a point that it's not needed. And so, with that being said, looking forward here, as I mentioned, I do see there's light at the end of the tunnel here, with how rapid Omicron has blazed through every community in every county of every state. There's going to come a point here where Omicron there won't be anybody to infect that hasn't been exposed or vaccinated to it. So, and that's a good sign, and the signs are right here. Hospitalizations are down, ICU admissions are down, and the rate of decline of infection confirmed cases are going down really, really quick. So we could see it, in 2 weeks when I come back and talk to you about numbers and what's going on. We may have a much different discussion as to what the next month or 2 months is going to look like. And so I'm hopeful that as these numbers continue to go down, that there's going to be a much cheerier message that is going to be talked about in 2 weeks. So I'm hopeful, and until that time happens, everyone stay strong, and We're getting close. We are getting close. So take care, everyone.